Hey everyone. I just thought this would be easier than writing out a blog post or trying to cram this into a affirmations and denial section. So there's been a lot of aggression, let's say, about a particular video put out by James White. So there are those who hold to classical theism as is articulated in the Reformed Confessions that God is without body parts or passion, who rightly recognize that this distinction between the attributes of God are notional differences, and I'll explain what that means when we get a little bit further in. And James White recently put out this video where he says he agrees with William Lane Craig's, which means the end must be near, but he agrees with William Lane Craig that to say that the attributes of God are all identical to each other and identical to the essence of God somehow makes God unknowable and is somehow a form of sophism, and just is not the way that biblically minded Christians ought to go. So I'm going to do my best. This is my first time trying to splice together these videos, but I want to let Dr. White speak in his own voice. I'm going to do my best to pull clips in. I will have a link in the description of this video to the full video so you can watch them in context. Don't take my word for it. Do your own work and your own research. But I wanted to give a little bit of a response to this.
Why was it surprising? I pretty much agreed with Craig's defense of his own position. He was responding to some guys from Southern Evangelical Seminary. And basically, without going into a lot of detail, it was about the doctrine of divine simplicity as promulgated by and interpreted by Thomas Aquinas. And if we were talking about divine simplicity simply in the idea that God is not composed of parts, that there are not parts of God that are more basic than the being of God. So God's being is not made up of lesser parts that you take a part out and there's no more divine being, but you can identify these lesser parts and you put all these parts together and now you've got God. He's not complex, but he's simple in that sense. Craig wouldn't have any problem with that. I certainly don't have any problem with that. I don't think historic Christian theologians would have any problem with that. But
all right, so White starts out here by giving, honestly, what's a pretty good definition of divine simplicity. And that idea that God is not composed of parts, and the key aspect of that being that God is not composed of somehow lesser or more basic parts that somehow come together and form God. That you can't, there's nothing you can take away from God because there's no composition within him. And so the key part there is that the parts do not contribute to the whole. God does not become God because he has certain attributes that are somehow more basic than him. And here's where I think Dr. White just gets right off the rails right off the bat. Is he then says that Craig would not disagree with this, that William Lane Craig would hold this view of divine simplicity, that he would agree that God is not composed of parts that somehow contribute to a whole and that somehow sort of give God his godness. Well, that's just not accurate of William Lane Craig's view. So you have to ask the question, is Dr. White here even aware of the fact that William Lane Craig doesn't hold the view that is anywhere remotely similar to what he has described here as the view that he holds, that he wouldn't agree with, and that the vast majority of Christian theology throughout the ages would agree with. And so just to be fair, right, we want to give people their own voice. Here's William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland, Philosophical Foundations of the Christian Worldview, second edition, published by IVP, I believe, yep, IVP. And he writes here on page 530, he says, divine simplicity is a doctrine inspired by the Neoplatonic vision of the ultimate metaphysical reality as the absolute one. It holds that God, as the metaphysical ultimate, is an undifferentiated unity, that there is no complexity in his nature or being. As such, this is a radical doctrine that enjoys no biblical support and even is at odds with the biblical conception of God in various ways. According to this doctrine of divine simplicity, God has no distinct attributes. He stands in no real relations. His essence is not distinct from his existence. He is just pure act of being subsisting. All such distinctions exist only in our minds, since we can form no conception of the absolutely simple divine being. While we can say what God is not like, we cannot say what he is like, except in an analogical sense. So Craig here denies divine simplicity, the idea that essence and existence are distinct. He denies it and says it has no biblical support and that it's at odds with the Bible. So right off the bat, Craig is not affirming that God is not composed of parts. He's not affirming that God is not composed of components that contribute to the ultimate essence of God, that contribute to the ultimate being of God. And if we look just a little bit further here in the book, I'm not going to read the whole section here. I've covered this extensively on the show. We did a whole episode on William Lane Craig, so check that out if you want the more specifics. But when William Lane Craig is describing his proposal for the Trinity, what he says is that each person of the Trinity is not identical with the Godhood or the Godhead, and that the divine nature is the Godhead. And he says that each person bears a component part relationship to the whole Godhead. So right off the bat, White has missed two major components of Craig's theology proper, and has said that William Lane Craig would agree with this understanding of divine simplicity that James White says he agrees with, that the majority of Christians throughout the ages agree with, and Craig would absolutely deny it. He denies that divine simplicity is a biblical concept. He says it comes from Neoplatonism. He denies that the persons of the Trinity are not component parts. He argues that it's a similar relationship to a cat and its skeleton, that the cat's skeleton can be feline, even though it is not the entirety of the feline nature. And I'm not going to go into too much depth, but Craig also holds this view he calls it anti-realism. More classically, it's called nominalism. And it's the idea that there is no such thing as a nature or an essence, that nature simply are a collection of attributes that come together to create a given kind of being. Right? So his view is exactly 100% opposite of what Dr. White here says he would agree with. So right off the bat, we're in a bad spot with this video because it doesn't seem as though Dr. White here has done all the research and understands the position that he is now articulating as something he agrees with by the title of the video, and then explicitly here by saying that Craig and him hold the same position. They simply don't. If he really does affirm what he says he affirms about divine simplicity and understands it as he's described it here, him and William Lane Craig hold very different views.
As Aquinas evidently takes this results in the thing that Jake was talking about, the idea that you cannot discuss the attributes of God in a way that would make them different from one another, because that then becomes parts, which denies the simplicity of God.
All right, so in the clip you just heard, he sort of articulates what he believes Aquinas' position is, and then he associates it with this classical theism that's being presented, and he says it's Aquinas' formulation. So that's the second claim of this video that we need to take a quick look at. So I want to read just a little bit here out of Aquinas. This is from the Summa Theologica, which is available in all sorts of formats. I bought mine for like $10, so I'm sure it's a pretty clunky translation on Kindle here. But the way it's set up is kind of similar to Turretin's Elenctic theology, where it presents a position or a question, it gives a couple objections, and then he responds to those objections. So in the third article, which is question 3, article 3 of that article, he says the topic at hand is whether God is the same as his essence or nature. And so the idea is that God as a distinct entity, is God the same as his essence, or is there some distinction between the essence of God and the existence of God, or the essence of God and the actualization of God? And so he lists two objections here. He says, it seems that God is not the same as his essence or nature, for nothing can be in itself, but the substance or nature of God is said to be in God. So this is him saying, well, there are some people who reject my view that essence and existence are identical in God, because God can't be his essence without some sort of incoherency happening. And then he says in objection 2, further, the effect is assimilated to its cause, for every agent produces its like. But in created things, the suppositum is not identical with its nature. For a man is not the same as his humanity, therefore God is not the same as his Godhead. So what he's saying here, he's using the word suppositum in a way that would be similar to how we might say subsistence or person, in that he's talking about an individual sort of a seat of nature, that the nature is sort of seated in reality and exists as a sort of concrete deposit or supposit of a given nature. And so he's saying here that the suppositum, the thing that exists in reality, is not the same as the essence which subsists in that suppositism, right? We talk about how God is three persons subsisting in one nature, or one nature subsisting in three persons, right? So that's kind of what he's getting at here. And so he says this is his answer to these objections. He says, God is the same as his essence or nature. To understand this, it must be known that things composed of matter and form, the nature or essence, must differ from the suppositum, because the essence or nature connotes only what is included in the definition of the species. So he's saying that in created things, that it's true that a nature and an existence or a hypostasis are not the same thing, that the nature and the suppositum are not the same thing. But in God, he's denying this. He's saying in God, there's no difference between his existence and his essence. And his answer to this is he says, we speak of simple things only as though they were like composite things from which we derive our knowledge. This is something we'll get to later. But in essence, yeah, what White is saying is relatively accurate of Aquinas' view, that there is no difference between omniscience and omnipresence, because in God, all of God's attributes are God. All that is in God is God. So his omniscience is identical to his essence. His omniscience is identical to his existence, because all of those things are one thing. God's omniscience is the entirety of God. God's essence is the entirety of God. And God's omnipresence is the entirety of omnipresence, of God's existence. So he's accurate in that. But now the question has to be, is this Aquinas' articulation? And I think we'll find out that it isn't. We'll pull up some quotes here in a minute, but the reality is that this is a view that was articulated long before Aquinas. It's a view that was articulated by the Reformed scholastics, people like John Owen, people like Francis Turretin, and it's a position that's articulated by modern theologians as well. So this idea that this is somehow some particularly Aquinas driven view, or particularly Thomist view, or particularly Roman Catholic view simply is not accurate. The articulation of what Thomas said is, but the idea that this is not the mainstream understanding of Christian theology proper throughout the history of the church simply isn't. All right, we're going to look to the first example, Augustine on the Trinity, right? Someone who has no conception of Aquinas' articulation of divine simplicity, since Aquinas would not be born for another 800 years after Augustine dies. And so this is from book 6, and it's item 6. Sometimes you'll see it listed as book 6, chapter 4, item 6. The translation I'm reading from is the New City Press translation. I think it's a good translation. It's easy to read, as easy as Augustine is. And he says, it's generally accepted to be the case that with human virtues, which are to be found in the human spirit, that although they each mean something different from each other, they can in no way be separated from each other. And so men who are equal, for example, in courage, are also equal in sagacity and justice and moderation. For if you say that they are equal in courage, meaning multiple men are equal in courage, but one man excels in sagacity, it follows that the other's courage is less sagacious, and thus they are not even equal in courage, since the former's courage is more sagacious. So what he's saying here is that even in human spirits, which are composite, right? They're not simple in the same sense that God is. They're not complex in the same way that bodies are, but they're composite entities. Our spirits are combinations of things that could be taken away, could be added. If you have one person who's courageous and just, and another person who's courageous and less just, then those courages are not identical courages. So what he's saying is it follows that these two attributes are inseparable from each other. And then he goes on to say, how much more then will it be the case, or will it not be the case, in that unchanging internal substance which is incomparably more simple than the human spirit? He says, for the human spirit is not, of course, the same thing to be, and to be courageous or sagacious or just or moderate. It can be a human spirit and have none of these virtues, right? That's where he's saying, if you take away courage from a human spirit, you still have a human spirit. But then he says, but for God, it is the same thing to be as to be powerful or just or wise, or anything else that can be said about his simple multiplicity or his multiple simplicity to signify his substance. So what he's saying here is to be is the same thing as to be just. You can't take away justice from God and still have justice. And if that's true, then whatever it means for God to be just also must mean the same thing for him to be holy. Because if you take away that holiness, just as it is in humans, if you take away that holiness, you have a different thing than whatever it is God's justice is. If God's justice is a holy justice, then that's different than a justice that's not a holy justice. And so he's saying that in God, to be is the same thing to be everything that God is. You can't have God's essence without God's existence. You can't talk about God's essence without talking about how God actually exists. Where we could talk about what it means to be a human who is courageous, or a courageous human spirit, without actually talking about any particular human spirit that is that thing. All right, next up, we're going to talk about Francis Turretin. This is volume 1 of the Institutes of Eclectic Theology. And this is the 7th question, which is the simplicity of God. So Turretin is organized in a variety of topics, and then each topic has several questions that fall under that topic. So this is under the topic of basically the attributes and existence of God. And he says in the 7th question is about the simplicity of God. And what I want to point out here is that he follows the exact same line of thinking that Augustine did and that Aquinas did, in that he says that we cannot talk about God's existence apart from his essence. And so here's where it gets interesting, is that as he's going through this, he comes to sort of the last section here, the last little issue, and he wants to go and quote certain kinds of church fathers, certain people who had come before him. And what he says here, this is item 17 out of this question. And he says, the fathers often insist on this simplicity of God. So this, he's saying that the way that these fathers are describing simplicity is the same way he's describing it. They insist on this simplicity of God. First, he quotes Augustine. He says, the nature of God is simple and immutable and undisturbed, nor is he himself one thing and what he is and has another thing. And that's from 1.5, so book 1, item 5 of on the Trinity, which we just looked at. So he's saying here that what Augustine says is that the nature of God is simple. It's not different for God to be himself, for himself to be one thing, than it is for him to be what he is. So his existence, his essence is identical. And then he says, after teaching that no creature is truly and perfectly simple, he adds, now although God may be called manifold, yet he is truly perfectly simple, for he is called great, wise, happy, and true, and whatever with propriety may be said of him. But with his greatness is the same as his wisdom, for he is not great in mass, but in virtue, and his goodness is the same as his wisdom and greatness and truth. And that's Trinity 6.7 that he's quoting from Augustine. So he's looking at the same thing we just looked at in Augustine. He's saying, he says the same thing, and he's saying God is what God is, and that means that everything that God is God. Everything that is the single, simple, one essence of God, which is not distinct from his existence. Right? And then he quotes Athanasius here. He says, God is not composed who composed all things, that they might be, nor is he such as those things are which he made by his word. Since he is a simple substance in whom there is no quality nor any shadow of change, as James testifies, and he's obviously referencing the biblical book of James. And this is a letter to the bishops in Africa, which you can find in the Nicene Post-Nicene Fathers, Series 2, Volume 4. And obviously, Turretin wasn't quoting the Nicene Fathers. That's just where you can find it now. But the reality of this is, notice he's missing. He doesn't cite Aquinas. He's not going to Aquinas to articulate this. So he apparently thinks that this view is floating around enough that he can support it apart from Aquinas. Turretin is not always absolutely hostile to Aquinas, but he's not really that much of a fan of Aquinas in some significant senses. He is following a scholastic method, but he has serious disagreements with Aquinas all over the place. So obviously, TURRETIN did not think that this was exclusively or even primarily Aquinas's view, since if he was trying to refute people, and it was the predominant Aquinas view, he would have used Aquinas, he would have cited Aquinas, but he doesn't. He cites ancient, more articulate church fathers that came way before Aquinas, had no idea that Aquinas would ever exist. All right, next up, we're going to look at a little bit of Herman Bavinck, Reformed Dogmatics. There are some quotes going around from Bavinck that seem to indicate that he agrees with James White here. I'm going to read a little bit here, and I'm going to show you that he doesn't actually. So here's the quote that's most popularly going around. It's page 124 in volume 2 of the Dogmatics. He says, although we cannot really make a distinction between God's essence and his attributes, seeing that each attribute constitutes the essence, right? So right off the bat, he's saying, yes, essence, attributes, they're the same thing. They're not distinct from each other. We cannot really make a distinction. It says, it does not follow that the distinctions among the attributes themselves are merely nominal and subjective without any basis in reality. So this is being passed around to say, see, look, Bavinck denies notion that these differences are notional. Bavinck goes on through a couple different examples of people who've articulated this. And then he says here on 125, which is just the next page, on the basis of God's revelation, it is our obligation against this view that the names of God, which is, he's talking about the Palamas' view, to hold on to the belief that although every attribute is identical with the divine being, right? So right there, although every attribute is identical with the divine being, he's explicitly said this twice now, that the attributes did not differ in substance, since God is simple and transcends all composition. Yet, on the other hand, they do not differ only in name. Right? So this is important, because this is we're going to get at when we get to the end of White's video here. We can talk about the different essence, the different attributes. We can talk about attributes in a way that doesn't mean we have to just say the same thing over and over again. Right? And that's what he's rejecting. He's rejecting this idea that to even speak about different attributes, to even speak about distinctions within the divine nature of different attributes is somehow incoherent. He's rejecting that. But then he says here, avoiding both extremes, they, meaning Basil and Gregory of Nyssa, they judge that the names of God differ in thought, that in our mind we have different ideas, thoughts, and considerations of the same divine being. Therefore, with reference to the different attributes, such as goodness, wisdom, etc., we do not just use different names, but in that connection really entertain different ideas. No single name expresses God's being with full adequacy, starting on 126 here, but are nevertheless many names, properties, ideas, and fitting honors by which some characteristics of God become known to us. Right? So what he's saying is that these differences, these distinctions, these are distinctions that we make, that they're in our mind, that because of the nature of our thinking and acting and talking, we have to make these distinctions. We can't just say the same thing over and over again. Just repeating the word God, God is God, God is God, God is God, that doesn't actually communicate anything. And so although they are really in the essence of God the same exact thing, that they are identical things, how we think about them, how we communicate them is not, we can't communicate them that way. We're incapable of communicating that way. And note, he's citing the Cappadocians, who argue the same thing, right? So he's saying that they support his view that in God, the attributes are identical with his essence, and that we can't have a real distinction between those things because God is simple, yet we have to talk about them. So again, another figure who doesn't make any use of Aquinas in justifying this view that James White is characterizing as Aquinas' view, which he's concerned about Reformed people picking up. All right, next up, we've got Petrus van Maastricht, right? This is volume 2 of his Theoretical Practical Theology. He doesn't address this quite in the same direct way, but he says something here that I think is really applicable to this conversation that Dr. White is missing. This is from page 77. He has an elenchic part of each of his little sections, so this is similar to TURRETIN's stuff. He says, is it asked, do we have a positive concept of the divine essence? So the question he's asking is, do we say positive things about the Godhead, or do we just say negative things? And he says it is asked first whether we, speaking of kind of the Reformed in general, whether we have a positive concept of the divine essence. A positive concept is opposed to a negative concept in this way. In the former, we ponder what a thing is on its own, in the latter, what it is not. Since Descartes and his followers suppose that divine essence consists in nothing except mere infinite thought, man carries in his mind the idea of infinite being, and absolutely nothing must be admitted except what we clearly and distinctly perceive. They state that we do not have a positive concept of the very essence of God. The Reformed, although they admit positive concepts of several attributes of God, even so concerning the very essence of God commonly, do not acknowledge any but negative concepts, by which we hold concerning the essence what it is not, rather than what it itself is. We've already set forth the basis for this view in section 4. We do not add anything here except this one point, that we do not even have such a concept of our own soul, though it is finite. So what he's saying here, and this is directly pertinent to what White is saying. White is saying that if we cannot talk about God's omnipotence or his omnipresence as though they are really actually distinct from each other, if they're not really actually distinct from each other in God, then we lose all coherence of what it means to talk about God. But if you read Maastricht carefully, what he's saying is even though we talk about things in positive senses, in terms of we talk about existence, we talk about God's omnipresence as though he is everywhere present, that's what the word means, we're actually talking about a negative concept in positive terms. So when we say that God is everywhere present, what we're really getting at is the idea that God is nowhere absent, right? So when we talk about these attributes as though they are actual differences within God, and we do talk about them as though they're actual differences in God, notice what we're doing. We're not talking about what the essence of God is. We're talking about what it's not. So even there, even if we do acknowledge, which we don't, but even we do acknowledge that the everywhere presentness of God, or the all instances powerfulness of God, what we're really doing is we're not talking about God. We're talking about God in this negative sense. So even if those things truly are distinct, we're still not describing the essence. So I know that sort of sounds like a little bit of incoherence, but it's an important part of the conversation, because what it means is that Dr. White is trying to use this sort of equivocal or univocal mode of speaking about God as though we somehow are really actually describing the essence of God in sort of a bare form, and we're not. That's what's really important about what Van Maastricht says here in his section where he talks about divine simplicity. All right, almost there, folks. I wanted to just give an overwhelming number of sources because I don't want anyone to go, yeah, well, you just picked out some of your favorites. These are my favorites, but it's a lot of favorites. It's a lot of figures. So next up, we've got Christian's Reasonable Service by Wilhelmus of Brockel. If this was distilling theology, we'd have some fun sound effect, but it's not. And this is on page 96 of volume 1 from the Reformation Heritage version. And he starts his section on the simplicity of God by saying, as we can neither comprehend the eternity of God, right? Sound familiar? Because we are creatures of time, nor the non-dimensional infinity and omnipresence of God, because we are finite and local in nature, so we also, being composite creatures, are not able to comprehend the simplicity of God. Since we must recognize, however, that all composition implies imperfection, dependency, and divisibility, we may not think of God as being composite, even in the most remotest sense of the word. Thus we acknowledge God in every respect to be perfect and of singular essence, right? So what he's saying there, right, same refrain that we've been going through this whole time now, God's essence is alien to us. We cannot speak of it in human terms and speak of it in strictly proper senses. It's not possible. Just like we have to describe God's omnipresence as though it means he's in every point in space, when in reality it means he doesn't interact with space at all. That space is not even on the same register of his existence. We have to talk about simplicity in these composite terms. And then he goes on, right? This is on page 97. He goes through several different kinds of division or complexity or mixture we might conceive of in God. And he says, ex essentia et existentia. That is, there is an essential distinction between essence and the actual existence of something. It is possible to comprehend the one without the other. It is possible to describe a rose and to comprehend what it is, even though during the winter, when no roses are present. Thus, we distinguish between the essential nature of a rose and its actual existence. Right? We're back to Aquinas and his suppositum and attributes. Right? It says God's being, however, is his actual existence, and his actual existence is his being. A truth which is conveyed by his name Jehovah. One cannot be distinguished from the other, and one cannot be comprehended without the other, for they are one. So right there, again, we've got this idea that his existence and his essence are not distinct from each other. And then going down here on page 98, ex essentia et subsistentia. That is, there is a distinction between nature or being and the existence or personhood. Subsistentia, or manner of existence, is complementary to the existence of a being itself, by which it possesses something which makes it uniquely distinct from another being. Suppositum, or the existence itself, refers to that which can in no wise be communicated to someone else, nor can exist in something else other in part or form. Something having such a distinct existence and being endowed with reason, we refer to as a person. Right? So he's affirming this distinction between suppositum and existence, and then he goes on to deny that in God we cannot distinguish between those two things. So we've got tons of classic Reformed resources that uphold this. Some of them come before Aquinas, and so therefore could not have understood or made reference to Aquinas. Several now that come after Aquinas and make no reference to Aquinas, making it clear that at least they did not believe that this was somehow characteristically or uniquely Aquinas's view. All right, almost there, folks. Last one here. We're going to take a quick look at a modern Reformed commentator who arguably represents sort of a modern Puritan understanding of things. And this is Reformed Systematic Theology, Volume 1 by Joel Beeke and Paul Smalley. And I'm going to read just a little bit here from, let's see, this is page 629, and the heading of this is The Historical Christian Affirmation of Divine Simplicity. It says, the doctrine of divine simplicity is part of the theological legacy of the ancient church. Irenaeus said he is a simple, uncompounded being without diverse members, and altogether like and equal to himself, since he is wholly understanding and holy spirit and holy thought and holy intelligent and holy reason and holy hearing and holy seeing, those are holies with WHs, and holy light, and the whole source of all that is good. Augustine said that God, quote, is what he has, thus he is in himself living, for he has life, and is himself the life which he has. He went on to explain that for this reason, then, the nature of the Trinity is called simple, because it has not anything which it can lose, and because it is not one thing and its contents another, as a cup and its liquor, or as a body and its color, or the air or the light of its temperature. God's simplicity is an important part of the Reformed confessional tradition. The Belgic Confession, Article 1, says there is only one simple and spiritual being which we call God. Richard Mullard says the concept of a soul and simple essence of God was understood by the Reformed as so basic a truth that it was early on ensconced in the confessions of the Reformed churches. The English Reformed confessional tradition, including that of Anglicans, Presbyterians, Congregationals, and Reformed Baptist churches, affirm God's spirituality and simplicity by saying that he is without body, parts, or passions. Right? So this is it. This is Joel Beeke saying, this is Reformed theology, folks. This is confessional Reformed theology. Everything that we've talked about so far, what Irenaeus says, what Augustine says, what Athanasius says, what Van Mastricht says, what Brockel, what Bavinck, what all these people say is the Reformed position. And then he goes on to list some objections to divine simplicity. And on page 632, he says, Objection 2. The doctrine of simplicity, this is the objection. The doctrine of simplicity, divine simplicity, reduces God to a property instead of a person because it identifies him with his attributes. That's the objection. And then this is his commentary. This objection is backwards, and when rightly reversed, it points us toward a beautiful implication of simplicity. God is not the power of the property of power, wisdom, love, and so on, but these properties are God. Not that love in general is God, but that God's love is God. Right? So here's where he goes on. The objection mistakenly reasons from properties of beings as if we could ascribe them to God univocally. Catch that? The objection, and this is the objection White's making, this is the objection Craig made. The objection is that we somehow can't talk this way because we can talk univocally about God. right? So right here, we've got numerous witnesses, right? Is James White right that this is Aquinas' view and that it ought to sort of be, we should be skeptical and somewhat suspicious of it because it's Aquinas' view? Well, he's not right that it's Aquinas' view in a strict sense. He's not right that this is somehow unique to Aquinas. It's not even unique to Roman Catholics. It's actually the universal position of the entire church until maybe like 70 or 80 years ago. The people who rejected it in the Reformation were the Socinians and the Anabaptists. The people who rejected it in the patristic era were the Arians and the Tritheists and the Pneumatomachians, right? The people who rejected this were the heretics, not the Orthodox. So the fact that he's aligning himself with William Lane Craig, who explicitly denies divine simplicity, and he's making this objection that all of these Reformed and patristic thinkers recognize as an objection and say misses the point because it forces us to talk univocally about God. He's aligning himself with the Socinians, the Anabaptists, the Arians, the people who denied the faith, along with William Lane Craig, who teaches really errant things about the Trinity and about Jesus.
So I know there are Reformed guys. R.C. loved Aquinas. There are Reformed guys that try to read into Aquinas, but there's just too much there that is thoroughly problematic to really rescue him. And so I am concerned because I'm seeing in a lot of Presbyterian circles, but Baptist circles as well, Reformed Baptist circles, this move toward a Thomistic emphasis where you transition the necessary fundamental foundational assertion of God's absolute monotheism. There is only one being of God. God's being is not complex. It's not made up of lesser subordinate parts that come together to create a greater whole. That's absolutely true. But it does not follow that a description of that being of God, such as his omnipresence or his omniscience, is an assertion that those things have being outside of God's being, so that they are some lesser item. That simply does not follow.
All right, so this is where I want to close. And this is why confessionalism is important, right? James White has sort of mutated some of his views. I'm not sure exactly what's going on, but there are a number of areas where it seems like his commitment to the 1689 confession is not exactly the way that it used to be. And I've heard that from Reformed Baptist brothers and sisters. I've heard that from Presbyterians who are commenting on it. I've observed it a little bit. He's embraced theonomy, which I suppose you might be able to make an argument from the Westminster 1646 edition about theonomy, but I'm not sure how you get there with the 1689. But so he's made some departures in some significant ways. But listen here to what he says. He emphasizes that if you take the logical step, what he's talking about, or you take the step to go from divine simplicity, meaning God is not composed of parts that contribute to his overall godness, and then take the step to say we cannot make descriptions of the divine nature. Do you see what just happened? Because he has been committed to confessional orthodox language for so long, he actually comes back around to actually articulate the position that people like Aquinas and TURRETIN and all these people we just read through actually hold, because it is the biblical confessional position that although God's nature is simple, and that to be God is not to be different than to be powerful or to be just, and that in God all of those things are one, that we still also have to talk about God in these creaturely ways, and as creatures we have to talk about God in these accommodated, analogical, somewhat improper ways. He gets there because he's been committed to this confessional position. So just to summarize, White has misrepresented Craig's view, which he claims to agree with. He's misrepresented, in a certain sense, Aquinas' view, and all of the people that we read that seem to hold the same view. He's misrepresented those by talking about it as though we deny that we can speak in descriptive ways about God, that seem to talk about his attributes as though they are distinct things. He's misrepresented that view because we don't deny that. And at the end of the day, he's come back around to to articulate the view he's actually claiming to be critical of. So it's important when we hear these videos, when we see these videos, not to just accept them because James White is a figure that may have been influential in our life, or to just accept them because he wrote a book on the Trinity, or because he debated a Muslim one time, or 1,000 times, or whatever it might be. We have to understand and go back to the Bible, especially. We didn't do that today, but we could have. We have to go back to the classic Reformed sources, and especially as a subordinate standard to the Bible itself, to our Reformed confessional heritage, and then assess what some guy in the 21st century who may have a vibrant ministry, who may have studied, who may have done all these things, we have to assess what he says in light of those more secure, time-tested documents. Do that with me on the show, or on this video, or on a blog post. Do that with a post you see in the Reformed Pub, or that you see on Twitter. We have to go back to the people who've gone before us, and especially to the Reformed confessional documents that we claim to uphold as subordinate standards of the Bible.